I thought the hardest thing would be jet lag, but actually being here has been very emotional at this difficult time for both of our countries, and I really feel just really honored to be here. As Gal mentioned, he gave me a challenge to look at stability. I have done one study, which I will share with one of my graduate students. Yeah, so I did a lot of learning to come here, which is a nice thing. Okay, so I have all kinds of conflicts, but these are my funding conflicts. So I have been very fortunate to receive funding from various federal and private foundations. And I also need to disclose that I receive some royalties from the nonprofit MAPI Research Trust Institute on the sales of the Itsy and Bitsy. Okay, so I'm going to very quickly, because Ilan did such a great job, present some of the data on prevalence and the increasing prevalence around the globe for autism spectrum disorders. Present also data on when first diagnoses are happening, because I think evaluating stability is actually very difficult from the current literature, and I'm so excited about the database that you're developing. I think it's amazing and remarkable and what we need to really improve our understanding of the course and outcomes for young children with autism spectrum disorders, and then dive into the stability of early autism spectrum disorders. Kids who are diagnosed early relative to those who are diagnosed later. I am not presenting a new meta-analysis or a meta-synthesis or a systematic study, but I will show some selected studies which I think are representative of the current state of the field. And then I want to talk about both research and clinical implications of what this means, because I know for me, every few years I have to really rethink what is an autism spectrum disorder and what do we know about it? Because as new information emerges, my old assumptions really just have to get thrown out the window. So I think an example of this is when the infant sibling studies first started, we think of autism spectrum disorder as a chronic, lifelong, very disabling condition back in the day. And I was positive, as a person who had seen lots and lots of babies across many different circumstances, I could spot an autistic baby at 6 months. This would not be a problem. And in fact, someone shared some videos, and I actually was pretty good at spotting autistic babies at 6 months, which was very misleading, as it turns out, because I was very good in this particular sample of spotting, I think it was 9 of 11 of the babies but it's not really how it goes. And I think I have a slide in here to highlight that. So this is just, I don't think I have to go over the DSM-5 criteria in this audience, but this is a handout we use for how we present the information to families and really try to link what we're seeing in this particular child to the criteria so that we're giving the parents really the information that they need to understand what is an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis at this moment in this child. Okay. So in terms of prevalence, basically, as Ilan showed for the Israeli context, rates of autism spectrum disorder are increasing globally at a pretty phenomenal pace. And under-resourced countries are reporting much lower rates, but that is most likely a problem of detection. Higher resource countries are reporting higher rates, and that is most likely a positive factor related to detection. So Australia has the highest prevalence at 4%, and you have just seen your local context presented beautifully. Why does prevalence matter? It matters because the earlier we can detect autism spectrum disorders, the earlier we can increase parental awareness and help parents develop strategies for supporting their children and themselves. it really does appear to make a huge difference in terms of long-term outcomes, and especially focused on not necessarily curing autism, but in terms of improving language and social communication outcomes, which will allow individuals to advocate for themselves and find settings in which they can optimally get their needs met. And policymakers also really need to understand and recognize the trends to be able to implement effective interventions and supports. Okay, so the CDC in the United States has been monitoring autism in 8-year-olds for many years, and they've recently added monitoring 4-year-olds, which, as you know, Ilan mentioned, how the youngest children are increasing at much faster rates than the older children. And I do think that's probably related to detection, but it also may be reflecting something going on in the environment. And I think that should be something we're concerned about. A shift in who's currently getting diagnosed from the olden days is that now 1/3 of children who are diagnosed seem to have developmental delays or intellectual and developmental disabilities. It used to be closer to 2/3. So we are broadening who we're diagnosing over time, and I think that changes in prevalence at this point probably don't reflect that, because we see dramatic increases from 2015 when we shifted to a new diagnostic system or classification of autism. And let me say, I'm going to use autism spectrum disorder, and maybe some other words pretty interchangeably. I also have been working hard to become more neurodiversity affirming. So at times you'll hear me being tripped up in my word choices because I'm old, and it's a cognitive or executive functioning task to remember to use appropriate language. Okay, so this is right from our CDC website, and you can see, I probably have a pointer too. Oh yeah, nice. Okay, you can see just we've gone from in 1992, 1 in 150, stable to 94, increase to 1 in 36 at this point, and boys are much more likely to be 4 times more likely to be affected than girls, pretty universally. So that is a much higher number in boys. Okay, so one thing though is you get for a country one number, and I think it's really important to keep in mind that that one number is a huge averaging across many other numbers. So many years ago, or several years ago, my colleague Chris Sheldrick and I took these data that are available from the CDC. So you can see if you're way up here in New Jersey, the rate in 2014 was really different than if you're in Wisconsin or Colorado, and Alabama probably was so embarrassed that they just stopped joining in that year. But so what we looked at in this study that's published is how much variability is significant behind the data. And in all these fancy multi-level models that my colleague Chris Sheldrick ran, it turns out that which state you're living in makes a difference, not only in terms of the percentage of children who are being detected and diagnosed, but also in terms of the slope. So how fast are the rates changing? And so these boxes in the first corner of this slide reflect, if you're not in the same box, like Wisconsin is not in the same box as Arizona, Missouri, or Georgia, you're significantly different in terms of your average prevalence estimates. In 2000, similarly, if you're not in the same box here, you're showing a different rate of change. And the prevalence estimates, this is from 2012, this is from 2000. And you can see, in many cases, depending on where in the country you're living, the rate of diagnosis is remarkably different. And I think this is true, like no matter what country you're living in, there are regions that have a medical center where kids can access, or people talk about it, and parents know to access services. And then there are parts of countries where it's either culturally inappropriate, stigma is very high, and we see much lower rates of detection and diagnosis. Okay. Okay, so this is the same slide on the right. Oops. But basically, this is really important, especially because services will be organized in terms of these rates. And so if we're not preparing for this huge increase, as Elon mentioned, we really are not going to be prepared. And it's already a crisis in the United States. Even in Boston, where I'm coming from now, wait lists can be 12 months near the city and 18 months in more rural parts of the state, and even 2 years at times. And if you think about, we want to be able to get kids services in the United States, you're able to, it's in Massachusetts, it varies dramatically by state, but in Massachusetts, if you're able to get a diagnosis, you can access many more services than before you have a diagnosis. So the diagnosis becomes a major barrier or gateway to services. Okay, so the other thing we need to take into consideration is if we want to understand stability, the population of children who get a diagnosis at age 2 is very different from the population of children who might get a diagnosis by age 6. So when we're comparing the stability of 2-year-olds to 4-year-olds versus 5-year-olds to 7-year-olds, for example, we have a problem because we probably have a different group of children at 2 than the population of children we're looking at 5. So this is really trying to a little bit reflect on that problem before we think about stability. Okay, so again, I'm a baby person. In the United States, we have a mandated, not funded, it's very United States oriented, a mandated but not funded system of early intervention services for infants and toddlers under 3 years of age. And so what we really want to do, it's very easy to access these early intervention services. It becomes much harder to access services once you're 3 in some states, not in other states. But basically, what we know about parents raising autistic children is that parents usually first express concern about their child, not necessarily I'm worried my child has autism, but I'm worried about my child. Something is not quite right, usually between 1 and 2. So people say 18 months, but it might be 12 months, it might be 13 months, it might be 14 months, some parents earlier. So parents are starting to express concern. Most often they're reaching out to their pediatricians, and yet the average age of diagnosis is between 3 and 4 in the United States, and children from minority or living in poverty, children whose English is not their first language are receiving diagnoses even later. And, I think, but here is the window. Some people talk about neuroplasticity because there's so much brain growth going on early on. But in fact, there is some data, old data, that if kids are able to receive services before the age of 4, the long-term outcomes tend to be better. And when I'm saying long-term outcomes, I mean in terms of being able to work, being able to live independently, being able to express one's needs, wants, and desires independently. Okay, so there have been a lot of improvements in early identification. So even though the average age of diagnosis came down to about 3.5, and it just has not been shifting, but there have been real progress made in terms of earlier identification. So in the United States, and I think this is really globally, there's a strong emphasis on Know the Signs as one of the public health campaigns. There's a strong emphasis on Act Early campaigns, and some state and local governments have supported early intervention efforts through legislation. Others, medical schools are improving training. Lots of pediatricians are now integrating screening for autism at 18 and 24 months into their medical records. Interestingly, we can't stop screening at 24 months, as I'll try to show. But what we know is that there is this increasing likelihood of being detected earlier. So in 2020, children born in 2016 were 1.6 times as likely as children born 4 years earlier to be identified by 48 months of age. And unfortunately in the United States, so there was improvement, and then a huge decline during COVID. The data for 2024 were supposed to be published this spring. Given what's going on in our country, I'm not sure who's going to be working at the CDC to analyze the data, but hopefully someone will still be there and we will know at some point what happened to the kids who turned 4 in 24. Okay, so this is just one of my own studies where we did a big multi-stage screening study in early intervention. So these are children in our Part C federal system. All of the kids have developmental concerns to be enrolled in the system. Depending on what state you live in, the magnitude of the developmental delay is either more or less. This was done in Massachusetts, where we have some of the highest enrollments. So about 20% of kids will be touched by our Part C system. That doesn't mean they're necessarily getting services, but we have very high enrollments. And this is sort of just a little picture. So we went into 3 sites. The red lines show our enrollment sites. The gray lines show comparison sites that are chosen because they're showing the same rate of diagnosis. So what this means is, what is the likelihood of a child in an early intervention system or agency getting a diagnosis. So this is our pre-intervention period at 3 different sites, or really for each of our intervention sites, there's 3 comparison sites. So this is the pre-doing the intervention, which is paper and pencil screening with the POSI, which is a little bit like the MCHAT, but shorter and has a not true false response format. And then with the BITSI for the autism parts of the BITSI. And and then followed by a rapid diagnosis that our team was able to provide as part of the research. But so this is the pre our intervention of teaching people this two-stage multi-stage screening conducted in the community, followed by a diagnosis at the university. And what you can see is each site shows pretty dramatic increases relative to the comparisons. So the intervention really did lead to much bigger detection, and the intervention is just this 2-stage screening with paper and pencil things. And then I don't know if you're familiar with Wendy Stone's STAT, but it's an observational screener that we had community early intervention providers administer to their kids. Okay, and what we see is like a very big effect of increasing diagnosis overall, as well as big improvements for English-speaking families and even bigger improvements for Spanish-speaking families. So the goal of our project was to address health disparities in access to autism diagnosis, and we were particularly successful for Spanish-speaking families. Everybody improved, but we were not particularly successful with Black families or particularly successful with other families. But yeah, okay. So screening can help. And when we're looking at stability studies, then we also need to think about, is this a sample like Karen Pierce's sample, where she's seeing kids who are part of her screen to treat model? So you might have a broader group of kids coming in early on, or is this a sample where it's just sort of clinical cases only that are being followed forward? Okay, so the results from our study takeaway is that early screening can be highly successful in identifying more kids. We went from like 3 to 5% identification to 10 to 12% of identification at our EI agencies. It also really suggests that once kids are showing developmental concerns, it's particularly important to monitor their developmental progress in relation to autism. Yeah, and part of what is important when we're thinking about screening is that, I'm not talking about screening today, although it's a thing I often talk about, but it really is important to think about screening as opening a dialogue with caregivers and families. It's really not, is the test positive or negative? It's about really starting a conversation that may evolve over several months with the family to help prepare them to understand what is going on with their child and to help prepare them to be ready to take action in terms of pursuing services. Okay, so this is looking at when kids first get diagnosed, and what we know is that many children are not diagnosed until they come into school. And actually, Gal, you were saying yesterday that there's sort of two big blips of kids. One is the young 2-year-olds who, are seen, and then the next blip is really when kids start entering formal schooling. And diagnostic delays are particularly common in the US context among racial ethnic minority groups, although there's been a change. By 8 years old now, the CDC data seem to suggest that that's evening out. In the 4-year-old data, we still see more disparities, but by 8 years, there seems to be equal rates of diagnosis. We looked at, so this is also the other point of what I'm about to show you is, Ilan showed all the levels of data that are being collected. And sometimes, I like some of the studies I've done where you have a thin slice of data. You give a parent, like a 20-minute survey to fill out, and you get really rich results from this 20 minutes of a parent's time. So this is also data that relies on a very thin slice of parent report data, but you still can learn a lot from it. Chris and I analyzed data from 2 different surveys. One is a national survey of children's health. So 95,677 parents or guardians were asked about their health, just their general health, but embedded in it, I'll show you the questions on the next slide. And then a separate survey of children's special health needs, which screened 371,617 households. These are really big national surveys. And basically they look at the kids who have special health care needs. For this study, we selected only those kids out. Both surveys had the exact same sets of these 4 questions. So has a doctor or other healthcare provider told you that your child had autism, Asperger's disorder, pervasive developmental delay, or autism spectrum disorder? So has anyone ever mentioned an autism spectrum diagnosis to you about your child? Does your child currently have autism or an autism spectrum disorder, which gets its stability, although we did not analyze that, unfortunately? And then how old was your child when you were first told? And then would you describe his or her autism as mild, moderate, or severe? And being assigned an ASD diagnosis in our analyses meant not only did someone mention it, but you see the child is still having autism. And for the for the severity questions, you had to have answered that question. But really what I want to think about is how severity, defined by the parent or guardian's perspective, strongly influences age of detection. So what we see here is that if you are severe, the red group, you're much more likely in both surveys, and it looks like almost the same design, the same distribution over time. You're much more likely to be detected early and detected even before you're 3 years old. So who's getting detected before 3? According to parent report, are kids who are perceived by their parents to be more severe. Kids who are moderately affected, perceived by their parents or guardians, are next most likely to be detected, but you can see many of these kids are getting detected in adolescence. And then the kids who are perceived as mild, their ASD is perceived by their parents are mild, the biggest group are getting caught as they enter school. But there's these other peaks that are happening between 7 and 9, and then in adolescence, as they're thinking about how am I ready to live independently and go to college or just move out of the home. And I think this also, if we look at these bumps, we can also think about how are social demands for children increasing, and how is it that maybe you're a 5-year-old boy and the biggest social demand is just run with the boy pack. That doesn't take seriously nuanced social skills, but as you get into middle school, as you get into, thinking your parents are realizing like, oh, am I ready to let this child be free in the world? It may cause some need for reflection. So similarly, if we look at the cumulative incidence of autism by parent-reported severity, what you see is the dotted and not dotted red lines from the two different surveys almost look identical. So the fact that, whether you're surveyed as part of does your child have special needs or not, you're coming out exactly the same. And, most kids are being detected by 8 or 9, whereas if you're in the moderate group, there's just a much later identification, and for the mild group, really much, much later identification in both surveys, although differences in parent reporting across the two surveys. Okay. The other thing that I think is really, really important to consider, which again, when we first started doing baby sibling studies, I thought we would be able to identify autism right away. I was so wrong, is one point of this slide. But basically what we see, so I'm going to show you two studies, one where Sally Ozanoff was the lead, and one where in California, and one where Lonnie Zwagenbaum is in the lead in Canada, and it's 4 sites in Canada. I think it's just 1 site at the Mind. But basically, this is a very large 418 infant siblings, so all of the kids represented in this slide have an older sibling who's been diagnosed with autism. They're coming into the study early before parents have concerns about the child, hopefully. And at 18 months, 24 months, and 36 months, these kids underwent a comprehensive evaluation for autism in each study by diagnosticians who really know what autism looks like early in life, so we can have a lot of confidence in these diagnostic teams. And what you see is of these 418 babies, at 18 months only 44 of them are getting a diagnosis, 374 are not getting a diagnosis. By 24 months, another 40, of the 44 who were diagnosed, 40 continue to have a diagnosis, 4 do not, but 3 of them by 36 months go back to having a diagnosis. So these diagnoses look fairly stable. But another 39 kids suddenly are now diagnosable. This doesn't mean they didn't have any concerns at 18 months, but they were not meeting criteria for a diagnosis. And then at 36 months, so we can see stability here, but at 36 months, another 42 kids are newly diagnosed. So this suggests that of the kids who get a diagnosis by 36 months, about a third meet full criteria for autism at 18 months. Another third are picked up here at 24 months, but another whole third of the group are picked up not until 36 months, which when I first saw these data, I was really stunned. And I think it's really important to know this because we used to say, oh, by 2, we'll know. And that was not true. A lot of things we used to say to families, just you have to throw out the window. So of the children, of the 110 children who have a diagnosis at 36 months of age, 60% of them didn't meet criteria at 18 months, and 28% of them did not meet criteria at 24 months. Moving forward with this study, I'm not showing the data, but additional kids do get diagnosed later. So we're not done detecting autism despite 3 very comprehensive evaluations earlier. And then if we think about how stable are these early diagnoses, from 18 months to 36 months in this study, there's 93% stability, which is really high. And then from 24 to 36 months, it's 70% stability, which means 30% of the kids who were diagnosed at 2 are no longer meeting full criteria for the diagnosis, which is quite high. So when we look at the next study, which is set up exactly the same, except my little circle shifted, but what you see is very similarly, so here there are 381 baby siblings. Only 23 get diagnosed at 18 months. Another 43, am I pointing? Yeah, I'm pointing. Another 43 are picked up at 24 months, and another 45 are picked up at 36 months. So this idea that if we screen at 18 and 24 months, we can be done screening because we got everybody is just not true. We really need to be continuing to screen in preschool, and we probably also should be screening at early, as kids are 5, 6, et cetera, at some multiple points through time. Here, the detection at 18 months is a little lower. So of the 103 kids with autism, at 36 months, 78% of them didn't meet criteria at 18 months, and 42% of them didn't meet at 24 months. And here the stability flips upside down. So the kids who were diagnosed at 18 months, moving to 36 months, there's only 74% stability. And if we think about the kids from 24 to 36 months, there's 93% stability. So I don't know what the differences in these two samples are, but these samples are big enough that those, if put into a model to compare them, they probably would be significantly different. Okay, and then this is also from Sally Ozanoff from this same sample. It's like, what is going on over time that we see kids coming into, moving out of diagnoses? So what this shows is at 6 months, for each of these behaviors, which are looking at faces, this one down here is directing vocalizations, which means you're not only vocalizing, but you're looking at somebody, you're using gaze to communicate. Here it is the social smiles per minute, so not just smiling, but smiling at somebody. And this is an overall examiner rating of social engagement. So one thing that's really important is each of these behaviors, so the blue dotted line is the kids who do not go on to get a diagnosis, the red line are the kids who go on to get a diagnosis. But what you see is in each case at 6 months, the kids look identical on average. So are there a few kids who might be already engaging in some repetitive behaviors? Absolutely. But mostly it's very hard or impossible to catch many kids by 6 months of age. And then the changes in trajectories also are very different. So for gaze at faces, the kids who don't go on to get a diagnosis are increasing over time, but not a lot, and the increase is later. It's like after 24 months. For smiling, also similarly, the kids who don't go on to get a diagnosis are increasing, whereas the kids who get a diagnosis are decreasing. But much more gradually, much more slowly. And I think people talk about regression initially as you have to lose 5 words. But what seems clinically, my experience, if we see kids over time, is the regression is kind of common, but it's a very slow regression it's not some loss of skills and some failure to acquire skills. But the overall impression was doing fine and then sort of gradually losing and becoming, coming into full criteria for autism. So I think the complex kind of developmental patterns and the different components of an autism spectrum disorder shift over time differently for individual children. These are like group trajectories, but if we put the messy lines of the individual trajectories on top of these, it would just look like a spider web. I mean, it would just be kind of a hot mess. So, okay, so at this point, I'm going to shift to stability of diagnosis. And again, I'm selectively presenting based on, this one has really beautiful pictures. This one did this. It's really not a comprehensive review. But why it's important is that when you're in the room with a family who either has an older child with autism and they want to know about their young child, or you're evaluating a young child where the caregivers are very, very concerned, what do parents want to know? What do caregivers want to know? Like, will my child ever talk? Many caregivers are extremely concerned about putting their child on a school bus because they can't know what happened there. They're very worried about many different things for their pre-verbal children or minimally verbal children. Will my child be in a special ed class at school? Will my child go to college? Like, he's 18 months. I don't, like we have some time. But parents are already there. And will my child get married? These are the things that, yeah.
Will my child be in the army?
Will my child be in the army? Yeah, here, very important, less so in our context. How do we get my child out of the army in the US context? But yes. Yeah, okay, and the understanding stability in the progression of early autism is essential for clinicians who face caregivers who have a lot of questions. Is essential for service providers, is essential for researchers, and also for policymakers and families. Okay, so the context, this is a mini review, is estimates of autism spectrum disorders are increasing globally. High-income countries are reporting higher rates than low-income countries. Children whose parents perceive their autistic children to be more severe across like childhood and adolescence, report much earlier detection. And even with opportunities for detection, many, many children will not be detectable yet. And then when we compare stability for children diagnosed under 2 or 3 years of age with those diagnosed later, we're likely comparing different groups of children across the autism spectrum, with children who are detectable earlier possibly having more impairing conditions. And I say conditions because it may also be comorbidities that bring parents in earlier. It may be that developmental delays, parents often come in because their child is not talking and then autism is detected. So I think it's important to think about who are we evaluating. Okay, so this is a summary slide for averaging across some of the DSM-4 studies that were done on stability, where we have PDD-NOS versus autistic disorder. And basically what you see is early stability for the autism group was not super high. These are all very small studies that are all problematic in different ways. But you see stability rates as low as 60, this stability of 68%, which is still like a lot of kids shifting. For PDD-NOS, much less stability. And if you dichotomize autism versus not, it seems higher, which means there must be a lot, so these are a combination of rates, but it's like 63 to 90 something is what's being reported. And the stability estimates are just all over the place in different studies, ranging from like 3% to 38%. It's just really a messy literature to review, so I accepted the challenge, but I was like, I cannot believe the end of my story will be, we need more research with better data. And the DSM-4 sample, 0 to 60% of participants are changing from PDD to later non-ASD, with a smaller number changing from PDD to autistic disorder. So in general, I'll say this again, but let me say it because this is really a good story, and I don't think it's on my next slide. Well, maybe. But the good story is, on average, now in every study I've been involved in where we follow kids, over time, and this is also consistent with all the literature, kids are gaining in developmental functioning and cognitive functioning and language functioning over time relative to standard scores. So not only are they gaining skills, but when you look over early childhood, they're having higher IQ scores, they're having higher language scores, and autism severity measured on the ADOS is going down. So in good news, as a group, the kids we see early are improving in a lot of different ways. So that's a nice thing to be able to say to parents. We expect to see gains. So many studies early on are reporting that kids who receive an initial diagnosis at 30 months or younger are more likely to not meet criteria later. Children who no longer meet criteria often showed much lighter, fewer characteristics of autism at the baseline assessment. The children with unstable diagnoses are also more likely to have had higher language scores, expressive and receptive scores. And most studies have looked at type of early intervention as a predictor and found nothing. I think the complexity of looking at early intervention is we don't have good metrics of quality or parent engagement or other kinds of things. So we often, when we look at early intervention as a predictor or a moderator, we find nothing. It's also, this literature is complicated by disparities in age of diagnosis, and few studies report differences in demographic factors, but most of them have very small samples that tend to not have a lot of diversity. So that's, okay, so this is the one study that I did with Ivy Geiserman-Kiss. It was her dissertation. And we did, so in the screening study that I showed you earlier, we invited about 160 families to come in very quickly for a dissertation. 60 said yes right away. So it was not like it was really just a phone call. And the 160 include people we couldn't reach. So it's not everybody. But of the children, these 60 children followed, 7 no longer met criteria for autism, which is 11.7%, which is sort of with the standard error range, covers like the 15% that was being reported most often at the time. And across the sample, we saw, again, significant improvements in cognitive abilities, nonverbal problem solving, fine motor, receptive and expressive language with Cohen's D ranging from 0.4 to 0.68 on the standardized outcomes, especially language improvements and reductions in ADOS symptom severity. Your baseline scores and follow-up scores, this is a 3 to 4 year follow-up, were very strongly correlated. So kids who came in with better language continued to have better language. Well, I can never find this pointer. The symptom severity scores also. So if you came in with a higher ADOS score, you continued to have a higher ADOS scores, demonstrating that there's cognitive and diagnostic symptom stability over time. The children who were diagnosed earlier in our sample, and this is in the context of all of the kids who are receiving services for developmental needs, all of the kids went through a screening study, so we pushed age of diagnosis down, but despite that, kids who were more severe kids who were diagnosed earlier had more severe symptoms at both evaluations. So there's a severity piece to early diagnosis that's going on here. What we found, even though it's such a teeny group of kids we're predicting to, older initial evaluation, higher initial severity, and longer duration between evaluations, but not developmental functioning were significant predictors of autism severity. So interestingly, in this study, the longer the time period, the longer you have to change. So I think also time interval, the longer the time that you have to change, the more likely you are to change, which works against the age of diagnosis because the younger kids are more severe. And higher severity, shorter time between evaluations and age of diagnosis increase the likelihood of losing your autism diagnosis. And then this is super exploratory, but it's a dissertation. Longer duration between evaluations and older age at initial diagnosis increase the likelihood of not having a diagnosis. I really want to say we looked at these 7 kids. We went back to look at the videos, and at least 2 of, some of them just, I think I have more on this, but there was this one child who I couldn't believe we diagnosed. Like, how did we diagnose this child? How were we so off? He's just seems amazing. He's playful, his movements are fluid and smooth. Like, I see nothing. I just see nothing. And we went back and we looked at the video of him at 27 months, and there was no question he met full criteria for autism. Like, this was not an ambiguous case. And it's just, so development is remarkable. And there really are kids who just not only no longer meet criteria for autism, but no longer have a developmental delay, do well on a pragmatic language assessment, do well, just are doing well, don't have other psychiatric conditions. Like this child, the parents called him their miracle child, and I fully embrace that. So, okay, oops. Okay, I guess I do know how to go backwards. So we saw very different patterns for predicting cognitive functioning than for predicting autism symptoms. Only cognitive functioning predicted cognitive functioning. And again, we saw nothing for services, and we didn't see anything for demographic characteristics. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to show you some other things. So this is Karen Pierce's study, which is selected mainly because she has very cool graphs, but also because she has kids who are diagnosed at 12 and 13 months of age, and they show the weakest stability, and that's likely both because of developmental factors. So Kathy Lord will say don't use the ADOS unless you have a developmental age of 12 months, but people also use the ADOS with kids who have a chronological age at 12 months. And if you think about many of the social competencies we're looking for, many of them come online between 8 and 10 months or 10 and 12 months, but pointing, like some things come a little later. And so it may be that when you have developmentally delayed kids and we're looking for the absence of competencies, what we're calling autism may be developmental delay as opposed to true autism. Like these skills may come online a bit later. Okay, so Karen Pierce followed a large clinical cohort that are coming out of her screen to treat model. So this is one of the cases where we might have a broader range. What you see is the diagnoses under 14 months. So this is just stability of diagnosis. The 12 to 13-month-olds show much weaker stability relative to the 14 to 17-month-olds, and then these, once you're 24, you look the same, or over 18 actually in the sample, you look the same. Features are highly stable early. If they come online early, they're highly stable, but having some autistic features but not meeting is very unstable. Developmental delay is much less stable than autism. Language delay is really unstable relative to autism, and here are just other conditions. Typical development is 25% of the kids switched into one of the many categories she was following. But what's interesting is here are kids who don't have an older sibling. The siblings of autistic kids show much lower stability. So they're moving a lot more than kids who come in without an older sibling. Okay, these are the really cool slides. So these are heat maps. And one thing, I'm not gonna, I know we're losing time here, but when you have 2 evaluations, you see different stability, more stability than when you have 3. If you have 3 or 4 evaluations, you have more opportunities to see change, and you do see more change. And this is, I think what's also nice about this is she is looking not just autism, not autism in a binary, but it's autism relative to other neurodevelopmental conditions. This study selected just because it's conducted in India, and with like a typical cognitive sample in this literature of 125 kids diagnosed with autism before they're 5. Follow-up assessors weren't blind to diagnosis, but stability is at 80%. And even though not statistically significant, because they looked at 0 to 5 years, under 3 years, stability is 87%. Over 3 years, sorry. This should be over, it's 87%, under is 77%, so they do have some difference. And among the 20% of kids in this sample who no longer met criteria for autism, all continued to have developmental challenges, particularly in language attention and social cognition. This will be the last study I tell you about, and then I'll do very fast conclusions. How timely are we here? Can I go over 2 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so Elias and Lord recently, or not so recently, but published a paper where Kathy Lord had enrolled 2-year-olds in studies. She moved around a lot to different universities, so you can see the cities in which she worked. She has aggregated samples of young kids, and she followed them quite remarkably at 2 years. They were first diagnosed at 2, they were followed at 3, they were followed again at 5, and then 9, 19, and 25. So this is really looking at stability through into early adulthood, which is quite remarkable. And she distinguished the kids who had IQs below 70 from the kids who had IQs above 70, and because the patterns were quite different. So among the individuals with IQs above 70, autistic individuals, 70.5% retained their diagnosis, which means almost 30% lost their diagnosis, and over half of the participants who lost their diagnosis did so in early adulthood. So either two had lost their diagnosis by the age of 5, 1 by the age of 9, 4 between 9 and 19, and 6 between 19 and 25, which is just not necessarily what I would expect as you go through 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 5, 9-year-old diagnoses. You're stable through childhood, early childhood, even you're stable through 19. And then, 40% of the sample loses their diagnoses in early adulthood is not something I would have guessed would be the pattern. Gains in diagnoses were observed in 7 of the 25 individuals who didn't initially meet criteria. And they included kids who didn't meet criteria but had some other developmental concerns, so that the assessors could be blind to diagnosis at each time point, which is also important. There were fewer diagnostic shifts among the individuals with IQ below 70. So I'm not saying IDD because they don't require an adaptive functioning measure included. So 94% of these kids retained their diagnoses, and the shifts for 4 of the kids were from autism to profound intellectual disability. And interestingly, 3 of the 4 kids who shifted were girls. And the kids who shifted to profound intellectual disability were much more cognitively involved than the kids within the low IQ kids who retained diagnoses. And I think, used to be like people would say on the IQ distribution, the most profoundly intellectually impaired kids and then the highest IQ kids are the hardest to diagnose. And I think this kind of reflects that at the low end. Okay, I'm just going to move on. So what can we take away? We need to know more. Unfortunately, my overarching conclusion is we need more research. We really need to think about who are we sampling? Are they infant siblings who, Nuriti or Mia did a study way back when in the beginning of the infant sibling studies here, and there was a lot of change over time back and forth, which was attributed to the sample being infant siblings, but it may be that this is just the reality for many kids, but we still want to keep in mind. So infant sibling studies, community cohorts, and screening studies. In terms of methodology, are the assessors masked to earlier diagnosis? What's the interval between assessments? What's the number of follow-up visits, which offer increased opportunities for instability? And then also, despite the use of gold standard instruments, methodological variance is introduced by regional, local, and individual differences in diagnostic thresholds. And Kathy Lord has written about this. And so there's even some science behind it, not just, you see different people diagnosing differently. And estimates really vary dramatically across studies still. And there's even mixed findings whether the earlier diagnosis, except for the very little ones, the 12 and 13-month-olds definitely seem less stable, but it's still is under 2, more or less stable, unclear. And the Zwigenbaum and Ozanoff studies highlight this. Okay, so in terms of kind of explanatory mechanisms, we don't know if at the earliest ages, maybe there's this developmental delay versus actual autism competencies not being present problem. We also have an issue, I think an important issue of the children with the highest support needs being identified earliest. So, really these early severe presentations may be more stable than the less severe presentations, which we saw in those 2 parent report studies. And then fewer symptoms or PDD-NOS versus AD is definitely associated in many, but not all studies with the elevated likelihood of not meeting criteria for autism later. So I've said that before. So I think you all are collecting the perfect data to be able to address this, like to the extent that you can integrate longitudinal follow-ups of your families into this open source data, it will be remarkable. I really do think we can leverage a lighter touch study, which is surveys of parents with more intensive sub-studies within the data to be able to figure out what's really going on, both qualitative and quantitative data at the sub-study level. And then administrative sources of data, which remarkably you're starting to link here, I learned this morning over coffee, are really hugely helpful in terms of knowing what's the number of services number and type of services children have received, and also longitudinal patterns in diagnosis and other comorbid, co-occurring conditions. Clinical implications. Many clinicians, such as myself, have needed to be in a constant process of revising our worldview of autism and autism spectrum disorders, especially, the life course. And our model of autism as a chronic, lifelong disabling condition may not match emerging global data and the autistic individuals we meet, or are teaching, or are interacting with in our daily lives. And most importantly, most children are showing improvements in all areas of developmental functioning, coupled with reductions in the number and intensity of autism attributes. And while these findings may offer families and clinicians a sense of optimism that, I'm giving your child a diagnosis now, at 2 or at 3, many children no longer meet criteria in 20%. I usually say 15, but I may need to revise now that I've done a deeper dive of the literature. But it also can create uncertainty in processing the diagnosis, and I think we really need to think about what the implications are for the clinician and for the family receiving the diagnosis, particularly when they don't want it, of what it means to say, well, your child meets now, but maybe not in 2 weeks. So, okay, and then, more research on the role of early interventions may ... I'll end here. Okay.